Counter-narrative news continuing with our special series on the British monarchy in the context of the coronation of the so-called King Charles III. This is going to be like a parents' and young people's and even children's guide as to being critical-minded as to what's been going on in the British education system, particularly when it comes to primary school children and the British state's monarchist, colonial, racist propaganda in shoving down this monarchist, feudal, colonial, racist concepts around the institution of the monarchy today and historically down the throats of our young people and children. Children are innocent. Parents are not really involved in curating and designing a curriculum that's appropriate to the children, many of which in the biggest urban centres in Britain and in England particularly have disproportionate concentrations of families that come from victims of the British colonial monarchist state of the former British colonies. So in the last academic year, the British monarchy distributed free of charge around British state-funded schools to primary schools a free book on Queen Elizabeth II. This was interesting because it came shortly after the relative radicalization of the situation of anti-racism following the summer of 2020, in which around the slogan of Black Lives Matter, many people took to the streets in protest against racist police killings and systemic white supremacy racism sparked of the martyrdom and the racist police killing of George Floyd in the USA. That led to a lot of what kind of window dressing and refinement of white supremacy racism by capitalist organizations and institutions, but it also led to more conversations about systemic racism across society and including in schools and including in primary schools and engaging primary and secondary school children. So the Queen Elizabeth II book and all the classes around that in primary school creates a deep confusion in the minds of the children. I remember sitting in year one class in South London in which this colonial monarchist racist propaganda was being taught by, as it happened, a woman of colour with a headscarf who was from whose family are from Turkish heritage. And then she was explaining how Queen Victoria, a previous and notorious colonial monarchical ruler of the British Empire, how Queen Victoria basically trafficked a young girl from colonized British colonized West Africa and forced her to become a quote-unquote adopted daughter. And in this year one primary school class, one could observe that especially those children of West African heritage, of which in South London there are many, wanted to take this story on as a positive one. But the story in itself, in its basic facts, is very confusing. And it didn't create any kind of pride and connectedness by the West African heritage children in this regards. Actually, it created confusion and a negative confusion as to why was this West African girl taken from West Africa? You know, what was the whole process? Why was her name taken away? And why did Queen Victoria then impose her own Christian Anglo-Saxon colonial name instead of the original West African name of the girl? So that was really sad to see. So we're going to share a couple of clips from BBC Newsround, which is the daily children's news program that the BBC has been publishing for decades and generations now. And Newsround is shown in many primary schools and secondary schools, if not most primary schools, including in across London. Now, we're going to go to a first few clips, and then we're going to make some commentary. So to the first clip.
Let's start with the crown. It's the centerpiece of the coronation, and there's even an emoji of it. Last up, the crown jewels. The orb is a golden ball with a jewel cross on it. It's designed to say that the new monarch's power comes from God. The scepters look like big golden sticks covered in jewels.
So here you can see and hear that in a format that's supposed to be attractive to and relevant to, in terms of its aesthetic, to young people and children, the British state propaganda platform, the BBC, through its newsround program, is trying to promote the crown and the crown jewels is something positive. There's no critical comments in it. There's no exploring the different sides as to the controversies and the histories of the crown jewels, the diamonds, the precious stones, and the precious minerals and metals involved. None of that is just to promote a very whitewashed notion of the crown. Now, a few comments. First of all, the crown and the crown jewels are a result of centuries of colonial criminal looting and extraction from colonized people's labor and their land. None of that is mentioned. So it's really wrong to be trying to attempt to inculcate children in this whitewash of colonialism and to be subjected to this colonial propaganda. And then you have directly connected to that issues of that they have power entrusted to them from God itself in the manifestation of the golden orb, and then power vested to them from God apparently with the spectre. So all of this, if you see how British children are then propagandized and brainwashed into believing that British values, quote unquote, so-called, are good, and one British value is supposed to be democracy. So how can you have a democracy that then has a apparently God-appointed power of colonial, feudal, monarchical rule, not only against the British subjected people, but the colonized people across the globe? Two things don't go together unless we understand that the British form of democracy in this quote-unquote British values is not democracy at all. And democracy is used as a cover to cover up the real ugly reality that this is a dictatorship of the monarchy and of its connected feudal, capitalist, aristocratic ruling classes, and then the wider capitalist ruling classes in Britain around that. Having a critical conversation from even reception year one is important for children to have a clear understanding of history and the world and where they fit into it. And then children are then better equipped then to making a more informed decision, as would be parents, as to how they want to reflect and decide and opt to relate or to be hostile or to be countering to this culture of British monarchist colonial racism. Then you have to understand the other contexts, political, social, and cultural, that the education system is going through, the staff within it, the hierarchy of staff in terms of classroom teachers and support staff, catering, ground staff, cleaners, and much more. But before we go to that, let's have another clip from Newsround.
Fit for a King, written by teacher turned author Banji Alexander. He hopes it will connect younger people to the coronation.
I think once you can get children excited about something, once it becomes fun and relevant to them, they will certainly engage with it. And New King makes the song and the idea of being a leader and having power very relevant to children. It's written from a child's perspective, so they are very excited about the coronation. They've never experienced the coronation. I've never experienced the coronation, so I'm equally as excited as they are. I'm the new king.
So in this clip, it's a classic old style colonial strategy and approach to co-opt those willing members of the colonized people then to be carriers of white supremacy and the toxic forms of colonial capitalist feudalism aristocracy that the British monarchy represents. And then you have this individual Banjo or Banji Alexander, forgive me, don't remember the name exactly, so forgive me for that. But here you have this individual then carrying out this project in what seems to be secondary schools in South London. And it's interesting because, of course, young people want to show off and express themselves and to do something through song and dance, and there's nothing wrong, there's something good about that. But then to use children's creativity and then to skew it into this direction is deeply troubling, is very opportunistic to say the least, and is borderline really using and abusing innocent children for a very nefarious agenda which is against all the interests of children, particularly working class, and particularly working class children from families who have been colonial victims or neo-colonial victims of the British monarchy and state. So to break this down a little bit further, in the clip, the young people themselves, interestingly, and young people always have a natural sense of justice, of what's fair, of things to be equally distributed fairly. But if you're going to inculcate children in an individualistic style of the British monarchy and the King Charles III, their reflections of that is also very individualistic. So normally children will talk about using big mansions to house the homeless, to feed the poor, but none of that is evident. It's all to do with taking as an individual, in an individualistic framework of colonialism, capitalism, monarchy, feudalism, etc., which the British state, the monarchy, and King Charles III all represent. Let's go now wider into the social, political, and cultural context of what's happening in schools and bounce off this thing. Now, when Queen Elizabeth II died last year, it was on the 8th of September, and as she dies, automatically the next in line to the throne becomes ascendant to the throne, and that was on September the 8th, 2022, last year. 3 days before that, on the 5th of September, police in South London and Streatham decide to shoot dead Chris Carver, who is a young black man in South London and a quite well-known rapper at the grassroots. This then creates a big problem for the British state, because then they are potentially facing black radical grassroots protests right at the moment where they want to deepen their propaganda and to co-opt vast swathes of the population in the far right trajectory of the British state around Brexit, the monarchy, the coronation, the handover, etc. And they successfully neutralized the Chris Carver moment they neutralize its ability to disrupt that whole agenda by ensuring that there was no radical protest and that the leadership of the Chris Carver campaign were co-opted by the British state and authorities by the fact that one or two of the leaders of the Chris Carver campaign had secret meetings with London Metropolitan Police Chief Mark Rowley. So that was negated. That potential of class struggle that is black-led and that fights for the basic dignity and humanity of working class people, particularly those who are racialized. But then let's go deeper still into this. Children in secondary and primary schools throughout the education system are faced with a number of problems here and oppressions. They are coming out of the pandemic, which was rife with rising racism in terms of the way staff were treated, disproportionately racialized staff who are relatively poorly paid and are often on agency, low wage, relative to the other staff upper up in the hierarchy as classroom teachers, and then head of year, head of subjects, and senior leadership, etc. So there's pandemic racism affecting staff, and the general systemic racism against staff in education, where again the poorly paid and the more precarious employed staff in education in terms of the catering, the cleaning staff, the ground staff, and the support staff in the schools, without which none of the schools could be able to run. But they ran the schools through the pandemic, and that was disproportionately racialized staff in that regards. And in the wider context, you have this ongoing, decades-long cuts and privatization, in which has produced trade union strikes in the last 6 months. I mean, the fact that the strikes are ineffective and even pursuing their own basic demands, that's a separate and connected issue. But it shows the degree of crisis in education when it comes to staffing, that they are now going on national strikes. And then you have a problem as well of the disproportionate racist targeting of working class black and brown children and working class white children around the racket of so-called SEN, special education needs, which is nothing really but a continuation of ESN, the openly racist, educationally subnormal that was here in this country until around the late 80s. So children are all faced with this situation. And so when you then pile on this British monarchical propaganda into it, it's a means of negating all these realities that parents are and their children have to face and that staff have to face in school, and then instead trying to make out that somehow things in society are all good and well, and then we have a literally God-given, feudalistic, aristocratic, racist leadership to gaslight us en masse to think everything is fine. And then you have the real interesting dynamic in this regard. Of course, exclusions from primary and especially secondary school are absolutely racist. 6 times more children are excluded from African and Caribbean, that's Asian Caribbean and African Caribbean, and Asian heritages than their white counterparts. And then you have the blatant police violence in the form of thousands of children, again disproportionately black children, being strip searched by police in schools. And you had that all blown up around the controversy of a so-called child Q, a teenage black girl who was strip searched during her monthly, being falsely accused of holding drugs in her bag. So let's sum this whole situation up. It's really important that parents are vigilant and critical-minded and critically reflecting about what their children are being imposed and propagandized by the British monarchical racist colonial state. We have to reflect and take responsibility for our communities and our children, who then become school-leaving age, often around 16, sometimes 17, sometimes 18, mostly around this age, then faced with the systemic racism of growing pressures and challenges around greater housing oppression, and in unaffordable housing, which means a whole bunch of problems, family breakdowns, mental health problems, all kinds of issues around that, growing precarity in employment, growing blatant far-right racism across society, which is seeing old school National Front, BNP type neo-Nazi racism being openly embedded in state Tory and British state policies and government. So taking all this together, it's really important that at this moment and going forward, not only do we have conversations and discussions around these realities and experiences of children in our schools, but we form grassroots parents' movements in unity with other members of our community and residential areas, and in unity with our young people and children, to counter-attack, counter-push back and resist all of this toxic colonial racism that's being imposed upon us, and then reassert our humanity towards resistance and liberation. Many thanks.